Welcome to China's Living Legends.
欢迎来到我的频道。
So, I want to paint a picture for you today. And, well, it is really not a pleasant one.
No, it's pretty bleak.
Yeah, it's essentially apocalyptic, honestly. The year is 1644. You are standing in the very heart of Beijing, but the sky is just like choked with ash.
Right.
The air smells like burning wood, terrified livestock, and just sheer panic. Outside these massive, supposedly impenetrable stone walls of the city, an absolute tidal wave of rebel forces has literally just broken through.
Take the gate!
And these aren't just any rebels, you know. These are hardened, desperate men led by this guy, Li Zicheng, who was a former postal worker turned warlord.
Right, a postal worker. It's wild. And the centuries-old Ming Dynasty. I mean, this is an empire that had stood for nearly 300 years, and it is literally collapsing by the minute.
Yeah, the sheer scale of the terror inside those walls, it's really hard to overstate.
I can't even imagine.
We are talking about a city of hundreds of thousands of people who are starving under a siege, and they're suddenly realizing that the ultimate nightmare has arrived. The streets are just descending into complete anarchy.
Just total chaos.
Exactly. The Imperial guards, like the men sworn to protect the throne, they are either actively shedding their uniforms so they can hide among the civilian population.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, or they are actively defecting and opening the inner gates for the rebels.
Wow. And in the middle of all this chaos, we find the absolute focal point of the entire empire, right? The Chongzhen Emperor.
The Son of Heaven.
Exactly. The man whose divine mandate theoretically holds the entire universe together. But, you know, he's not leading some glorious cavalry charge. He's not making a heroic last stand in the throne room. He's actually left the massive sprawling complex of the Forbidden City. He's been entirely abandoned by his vast network of civil officials, his generals, even his personal bodyguards.
Everyone just bailed on him.
Totally bailed. So he walks up Coal Hill, which is this artificial mound just north of the palace. I think it was built generations earlier from the earth they excavated to make the palace moats.
Right, yeah, exactly.
So he goes up there, he looks down at his magnificent capital just burning to the ground. And then, in an act of sheer, suffocating desperation, he hangs himself from a tree.
It is such a haunting image.
It really is. It's this incredibly tragic final moment, like the absolute peak of earthly power, ending in the most solitary, pathetic way imaginable.
Which, you know, brings us to one of the most striking and debated paradoxes in historical statecraft.
Yeah.
Because when we picture the dramatic collapse of a massive historical dynasty, we are really conditioned to expect a very specific narrative.
Oh, for sure. We expect the final ruler to be this completely decadent guy.
Right. We imagine an emperor entirely disconnected from reality, you know, spending his days drinking wine, building lavish pleasure palaces, and just completely ignoring the pleas of his advisors while the barbarians are literally at the gates.
Right, the classic Mad King trope, the guy who like fiddles while Rome burns.
Exactly. Yeah, that is the assumption we bring to these stories. But it completely falls apart when you look at the Chongzhen Emperor. Because he was arguably one of the most hardworking men to ever sit on the dragon throne.
Wait, really?
Oh, yeah. He wasn't partying at all. He was famously diligent, like almost to the point of obsession. He worked these grueling hours reading provincial reports late into the night, refusing luxury, skipping meals.
Wow.
Yeah, he was desperately trying to micromanage his empire out of a death spiral. She was entirely aware of the crisis.
Well, he wasn't blind to it at all. He was actively trying to fix it.
He was trying everything he could think of.
Right. So our mission for this deep dive today is to really dig into the hidden economic logic behind that massive collapse. Because we want to look past that traditional, simplistic, historical view, you know, the one that just blames the fall of the Ming on a few immoral, unpatriotic officials.
Yeah, that narrative is just too easy.
Exactly. So by digging deeply into modern economic game theory, historical financial records, and the foundational social contracts of the empire, we are going to unpack the fatal flaws of imperial finance.
It's fascinating stuff.
It really is. Specifically, we're going to examine this mechanism known as the donation system, and we'll uncover the terrifying structural rot that caused a government to fail exactly when it needed its people the most.
To really understand the mechanics of that failure, we have to look at the timeline just just days before the emperor took his own life.
Okay, set the scene for us.
Well, the situation on the city walls was completely untenable. Chongzhen knew his administration was totally out of money to pay the soldiers defending Beijing.
Right.
These soldiers hadn't been paid in months. They were starving. Their morale was absolutely non-existent. And they were, like, openly threatening to mutiny and just let the rebels walk right in.
I mean, you can't really blame them if you're starving and not getting paid.
Exactly. So, faced with this immediate existential threat, the emperor calls an emergency meeting.
Okay.
He brings in his top civil officials, his decorated military officers, and the fabulously wealthy eunuchs who ran the inner court. And he personally pleads with them.
He's actually begging them.
Yes. He begs the wealthiest men in the known world to open their private coffers and donate money to a defense fund.
So he's essentially trying to run this, like, emergency 11th hour crowdfunding campaign to save the state.
That is exactly what it was.
Yeah.
A desperately late crowdfunding campaign. And the result of that desperate plea from an absolute monarch, well, it tells us everything about the internal rot of the system.
What happened?
From the entire assembled elite of the Ming Empire, he managed to scrape together a grand total of about 200,000 taels of silver.
Okay, I want to pause right there. Because 200,000 taels, I mean, just saying the number, it sounds like a massive amount of money. Like, if I beg my friends for cash and they hand me 200,000 of anything, I'm feeling pretty good about it.
Right, it sounds like a lot.
So are we sure they were just being cheap? Like, maybe they really were tapped out from years of war and famine.
It definitely sounds impressive until you look at the actual burn rate of the Ming military machine.
Okay, give me some context.
So a tael is a measure of silver, roughly equivalent to about 1.3 ounces. At that time in history, a single tael might buy enough rice to feed a peasant family for a month.
Oh, wow. Okay, so one tael is actually quite a bit for a normal person.
For a normal person, yes. But we are not feeding a family. We are talking about funding a massive imperial army holding the walls of one of the largest cities on Earth.
Right.
Plus, they needed to pay months of overdue back pay just to prevent a mutiny. So in the context of a national defense budget, 200,000 taels it's basically a rounding error.
Oh, I see.
It was a drop in the ocean. Honestly, it is historically embarrassing.
And the optics of the meeting make it even worse, right? Because the historical records describe these incredibly wealthy officials literally crying in front of the emperor.
Oh yeah, the theatrics were absurd.
Right. They showed up in threadbare, patched clothes. They swore they were completely broke, claiming they were, like, living on meager scraps and selling their family heirlooms just to survive.
Yeah, and for centuries, the traditional narrative has just taken that scene at face value to condemn those men.
As just being greedy.
Exactly. The standard interpretation points to those officials and labels them shameless, unpatriotic cowards. The story goes that they doomed their own empire because of pure moral failure and personal greed.
I mean, it is a very satisfying narrative. We all love a story where greedy, corrupt politicians get what's coming to them and ruin everything in the process.
It is.
It's clean, it's simple, and it gives us very clear villains.
It is satisfying, sure, but it completely obscures the much more complex reality of the situation. Stopping at moral failure ignores the brutal economic calculations that were happening behind closed doors.
Right.
The idea that these men were simply poor shatters the moment we look at the immediate aftermath of Beijing falling.
Right. That aftermath is where the hypocrisy gets exposed in the most violent way possible.
Right.
Because, okay, the city falls. The emperor is dead on Coal Hill. The rebels swarm the capital. And Li Zicheng's forces, they are not looking to build some gentle, forgiving new administration.
Oh, no.
They immediately round up all those exact same elite officials who, just days prior, were weeping to the emperor about how they didn't have a single silver coin to spare.
Right. The rebels did not ask politely for defense donations.
Yeah.
They implemented a system of brutal, terrifying wealth extraction.
Yeah, they used physical torture. They constructed these horrific crushing devices designed specifically for the hands and ankles of the scholar officials.
It was gruesome.
They subjected them to agonizing pain. And miraculously, under the threat of having their bones turned to powder, these supposedly penniless officials suddenly remembered where they had buried hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions of taels of silver in their courtyards.
Or hidden away in secret cellars.
Yeah.
The wealth was there all along.
It's crazy.
The capital existed within the city walls. It just wasn't being made available to the state.
This scenario is just mind-blowing to me. Like, think about it in the context of a modern crisis. It is like A CEO begging the board of directors for a desperate financial bailout while the company headquarters is actively engulfed in flames.
That's a great way to picture it.
Right. And the board members just shrug, turn out their empty pockets and say, sorry, we're totally tapped out. There is simply nothing we can do.
Our hands are tied.
Exactly. So the CEO jumps out the window in despair. Then the ruthless rival company comes in, stages a violent hostile takeover, pulls down the ceiling tiles in the executive washroom, and finds hundreds of millions of dollars the board members had secretly stashed away.
That hostile takeover analogy gets right to the very heart of the paradox. Because if the city falls, these officials know they are going to lose their wealth to the rebels anyway.
Right.
And they did.
Right.
Many of them lost their fortunes and their lives. So the glaring question remains. If you know the invading force is going to physically torture you to take your money, why not just voluntarily pay the emperor's soldiers to defend the city walls and keep the invaders out?
See, this is exactly where I struggle with their logic. Even from a purely selfish standpoint, funding the security guards seems like a much better play than waiting for the violent warlord to show up with a bone crusher.
You would think so.
Doesn't self-preservation, let alone patriotism, dictate that you fund the defense?
Well, you're assuming they believe the defense could actually succeed.
Oh.
Yeah. To understand their refusal, we really have to strip away the concepts of patriotism and examine this through the cold, calculated lens of game theory.
Okay, break that down for me.
These officials were incredibly greedy, certainly, but they were not blinded by irrational greed. They were highly educated administrators making a stark risk assessment. When they look at the Ming Corporation, they didn't just see a company struggling through a rough quarter.
What did they see?
They saw a venture that was visibly, irredeemably bankrupt.
Ah, so they were looking at the macroeconomic balance sheet of the empire. They saw the relentless rebel uprisings in the provinces, the catastrophic famines, the empty state treasury, and just the total collapse of structural integrity.
Exactly. They saw a sinking ship. In a healthy economic environment, if you are an investor in a company that hits a temporary rough patch, injecting capital makes sense.
Right. You buy the dip.
Right. You buy more shares, you provide a bridge loan, because you fundamentally believe in the long-term viability of the enterprise. You want to protect your equity and ride out the storm.
Like you throw water on the fire because you still want to live in the house.
Perfectly said. But what happens when the foundation of the house has already crumbled, the roof is caved in, and the creditors are literally banging on the front door with torches?
Right.
What happens when the business model is fundamentally broken, the leadership is flailing, and the market has completely turned against you? In that dire scenario, no rational investor throws good money after bad.
You don't empty your personal savings account just to buy 3 more days of operation for a factory that is definitely going to close.
Precisely the opposite. You hoard your remaining capital. For these Ming officials, refusing the emperor wasn't perceived internally as an act of treason. No, in their calculated view, it was a financial exit strategy. They operated under the assumption that the Ming Dynasty was entirely finished, regardless of whether they donated a few thousand taels.
Wow.
Their goals shifted from saving the state to securing enough liquid assets to bribe the incoming regime. They were hoping to survive the transition and maintain their social standing under the new warlords.
So they were basically saving their money to pay off the new boss.
Exactly.
I mean, they drastically miscalculated the sheer brutality of Li Zicheng's rebels, of course. But you're saying their initial refusal to fund the emperor was economically rational within their own twisted framework?
It was.
They viewed the empire merely as an investment vehicle, and that vehicle was no longer providing returns, so they cut their funding.
It is a chilling realization about the nature of the state at that time.
It's terrifying, honestly. Viewing your own country, the society that gave you your wealth and status, merely as a failing stock option to be discarded.
Right.
But this mercenary mindset wasn't always the dominant culture, was it?
No, not at all.
Right. To understand how the absolute elite of the empire came to view their sacred duty as a mere financial transaction, we have to look at the mechanics of how people gained power in the first place.
Yes, we need to examine the architecture of the back door to power. The crisis of 1644 was the catastrophic culmination of a practice known as the donation system, or wanxian.
Okay, let's define wanxian, because this wasn't some desperate New Age concept invented by the Chongzhen emperor in his final days, right? The roots of this system dig deep into ancient history.
Very deep. The terminology itself is quite revealing. Wan means to relinquish, to donate, or to pay a tax.
Okay.
and Xiam means to offer to the state or to purchase. The concept traces its origins all the way back before China was a unified empire.
We're talking way back.
Right, during the era of the Qin state, prior to the famous Qin Dynasty unification in 221 BC. During those periods of intense, relentless interstate warfare, governments faced massive, urgent resource deficits.
Because wars are expensive.
Incredibly expensive. So pragmatic administrators established a system where wealthy citizens could donate massive quantities of grain to the state military granaries in direct exchange for noble titles.
It's literally a cash for honors system, but utilizing grain to feed armies instead of paper money.
Exactly. And it was a highly effective emergency measure. Because it successfully funded wars without requiring the state to overhaul its complicated tax collection systems, the practice proved incredibly resilient.
It stuck around.
It really did. It survived the fall of the Qin, persisted through the Han Dynasty, and continued to mutate over centuries. By the time the Ming Dynasty took power in the 14th century, they had formalized and institutionalized this system to a staggering degree.
Okay, so how did the Ming use it?
Well, in the early decades of the Ming, the parameters were somewhat restricted. It functioned as a bypass mechanism for the lower rungs of the educational ladder.
So skipping grades.
Sort of. If a young man from a highly affluent merchant family donated a designated substantial amount of grain, military horses, or silver bullion directly to the state treasury, he could bypass the grueling local exams and purchase direct admission into the prestigious Imperial Academy. It was a paid shortcut into the elite educational track that ultimately led to the civil service.
But the trajectory of these systems is almost always the same, right? As dynasties age, their administrative overhead swells, their military campaigns become more expensive, and their financial desperation grows.
Exactly.
Consequently, their standards inevitably slip. By the mid to late Ming Dynasty, what started as an educational shortcut had metastasized into a massive, wide-open backdoor into the core of the government.
It blew wide open.
Wealthy donors were no longer just buying a spot in a classroom. The state provided a menu of power.
A literal menu.
Yeah. A wealthy individual could choose to buy shiny honorary titles purely to boost their local social prestige, or, far more dangerously, they could directly purchase actual functional appointments to government office.
And the scale of that cognitive dissonance is staggering when you contrast it with the legitimate, celebrated path to power in Imperial China.
Oh, we have to talk about the Imperial exams, the Qiju.
Yes.
To truly grasp the prestige of the traditional exam system, you have to imagine combining the pressure of the SATs, the rigorous memorization of a bar exam, the intense scrutiny of a PhD defense, and the elite branding of a Harvard degree.
Right.
And compressing it all into one unimaginably grueling, multi-day, high-stakes test.
The physical and mental toll of the Qiju cannot be overstated. We're talking about young boys who began studying classical texts, literally from the moment they could read.
Decades of their lives.
Decades. They spent decades memorizing vast, sweeping libraries of Confucian philosophy, mastering complex, highly specific poetic forms, and writing these rigid policy essays known as eight-legged essays.
And the exam conditions themselves were just a nightmare. Candidates were locked inside tiny individual cells in massive testing compounds for 3 days and 1 night.
That sounds like a prison.
It basically was. They had a wooden board that served as a desk during the day and a bed at night. They brought in their own food and water. They endured freezing cold or blistering heat. Men would literally go insane under the pressure or die of exposure in their cells, all for a fraction of % chance of passing.
Yeah, the pass rates were astronomically low.
Yeah.
Often less than 1 or 2% at the highest metropolitan levels.
It was the ultimate punishing meritocracy. If you survived that crucible and passed the highest levels of the Qiju, you were revered almost as a demigod in your home province.
Absolutely.
You were the intellectual, moral, and administrative cream of the crop. You represented the only legitimate brand of the ruling elite.
Now hold that image of immense, lifelong intellectual sacrifice and physical endurance.
Okay.
Contrast it directly with the mechanics of the donation system.
It's absolute madness. It is the equivalent of the government openly placing congressional seats or federal judgeships on an auction block to the highest bidder just to fund a bridge repair or a minor border skirmish.
It really is.
You have one magistrate who sacrificed his youth, ruined his eyesight, studying classical texts by candlelight for 40 years to earn his position. And sitting right next to him in the provincial office is a man who acquired the exact same rank simply because he handed over a heavy chest of silver generated by his father's lucrative silk trading business.
And the friction between those two men, and what they represent creates an incredible cognitive dissonance within the very heart of the state apparatus.
I bet.
Let's break down the core transaction occurring under the Wanxian system. At its absolute essence, the monarch is taking the sacred privileges of the state, the immense power to govern populations, to extract taxes, to administer justice, and trading them away for a private citizen's personal wealth.
It's the total privatization of public authority.
Yes, exactly. And on a purely superficial level, looking at a spreadsheet, you can see the immediate appeal for a desperate ruler.
Because it solves the cash flow problem.
Right. It provides a massive injection of emergency revenue without the politically dangerous and logistically difficult process of overhauling the national tax system. Furthermore, political theorists of the time argued that it brought wealthy, influential local families into the state's support base. By selling them a title, you supposedly give the rich a vested stake in the survival of the government.
I mean, that might balance the books for a few months, but the long-term impact on the brand of the empire is completely devastating. You are visibly diluting the prestige of your own government.
You are actively bankrupting the moral authority of the state.
Yes.
The entire Chinese imperial system was predicated on the idea that governance is based on profound moral learning, classical wisdom, and Confucian virtue.
Right.
When you broadcast that philosophy to your subjects, but then turn around and visibly sell the judge's gavel to a wealthy merchant who hasn't read a single classic text, you destroy the integrity of the institution.
Because the public isn't stupid.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The peasants aren't blind. They see that money, not merit, dictates justice.
You know, you would assume that after watching the Ming Dynasty utterly collapse under the weight of this mercenary, hollowed-out mindset, the subsequent rulers would outlaw the practice immediately.
You would think so.
But the Qing Dynasty, the Manchu rulers who swept down from the north, defeated Li Zicheng and took over the empire, they didn't abolish the donation system.
No, they took the exact opposite approach. The Qing Dynasty didn't just tolerate the donation system, they institutionalized it, refined it, and deployed it as a deliberate, highly calculated political weapon.
Wow.
Examining the Qing strategy reveals the true toxicity of treating public office as a tradable commodity.
I am really struggling to understand the logic there. Why would a new, vigorous dynasty double down on a system that so clearly breeds incompetence and structural rot? What was the Qing strategy?
Well, the Qing strategy was rooted in profound paranoia. You have to understand their specific demographic insecurity.
Okay.
The Qing were Manchus, a distinct ethnic minority from the Northeast. They had just conquered a massive, sprawling empire populated by a staggering majority of Han Chinese.
Right.
The Manchus possessed military supremacy, but they lacked the administrative manpower to actually run the complex agrarian society of China. They relied heavily on the existing Han bureaucracy to collect taxes and maintain order.
So they needed the very scholars they had just conquered to help them rule?
Exactly the problem. And the Qing rulers harbored a deep, abiding fear of those traditional, exam-passing Han scholar bureaucrats.
Because those scholars felt inherently entitled to their power, like they earned it.
Consider the mindset of a high-level exam graduate. If a man spends 30 years mastering the Confucian classics, survives the horrific exam cells, and passes the most difficult intellectual test in the world, he firmly believes he earned his spot.
Yeah, nobody gave it to him.
Right. His loyalty is pledged to the abstract, timeless ideals of Confucianism, to the longevity of the state, and to his own intellectual peer group. He does not necessarily feel a deep personal debt of gratitude to the specific Manchu emperor currently sitting on the throne.
So the scholar looks at the emperor and thinks, I understand the mandate of heaven, I know how to balance the treasury, you just happen to command the guys with the swords.
That dynamic is terrifying for an absolute monarch trying to solidify control over a newly conquered population. The emperor demands officials who are completely personally loyal to his specific dictates, not to an abstract philosophy.
Right.
The Qing rulers realized they needed a counterbalance. By expanding the donation system and allowing wealthy individuals to buy their way into the bureaucracy, they intentionally cultivated a distinct secondary class of officials.
So they basically created a parallel bureaucracy.
Yes, exactly. These donor officials lacked the immense prestige of the exam graduates. They were openly mocked and looked down upon by the traditional literati. They were socially isolated within the halls of government.
And because they were isolated, and because they owed their entire political existence directly to the financial transaction they made with the throne, they were theoretically entirely dependent on and beholden to the emperor.
You've got it. The king weaponized them to dilute the power, arrogance, and cohesion of the traditional scholar bureaucrats.
But the internal logic here seems fundamentally flawed to me. The emperor is intentionally breeding systemic corruption just to secure personal loyalty.
Well, yes.
If a man literally buys his job, he isn't entering the magistrate's office with the noble mindset of a public servant. He is entering the office with the mindset of a debt collector.
The economic reality of treating public office as a commodity is brutal and inescapable. When you require someone to purchase a position, the entire concept of public duty or civic virtue evaporates instantly.
Poof, gone.
The government position ceases to be a sacred trust. It becomes a pure investment vehicle.
And what does any rational investor demand from a major capital outlay? They demand a return on investment. They need ROI.
Let's trace the life cycle of a bought office. A wealthy provincial family scrapes together a massive fortune, perhaps pooling resources from multiple relatives, to purchase a magistracy for their son. That son then travels to his new post in a distant rural county. When he arrives, he does not view the local peasants as his flock to be shepherded, protected, and nurtured according to Confucian ideals.
No, of course not.
He views them as the captive revenue stream required to pay back his family's initial massive investment.
He has to extract wealth just to break even, let alone turn a profit.
He is structurally compelled to exploit the population by the very nature of how he acquired the job. He will invent exorbitant new administrative fees. He will take lucrative bribes to tilt legal disputes in favor of the wealthy.
Right.
He will systematically skim off the top of imperial tax collections. These donor officials inevitably squeeze the local populace dry.
Wow.
This wasn't a case of a few bad apples succumbing to temptation. It was structural corruption. The financial mechanics of the system demanded it.
It creates this inescapable death spiral. Like the state experiences a financial crisis, so it sells offices for quick cash.
Right.
The individuals who buy those offices ruthlessly squeeze the peasantry to recoup their investment. The peasantry, driven to starvation by the corruption, eventually rise up in violent rebellion.
Exactly.
The rebellion creates a massive new military emergency. The state desperately needs more money to fight the rebels, so it sells even more offices. The legitimacy of the government just grinds itself to dust.
This deeply transactional mindset, this idea of viewing the grand imperial project as a business and one's role within it as a private wealth-extracting investment, didn't materialize out of nowhere during the late Ming or the Qing dynasties.
Right, it has deeper roots.
It was the terminal symptom of a fundamentally broken social contract. To truly grasp how the relationship between the ruler and the ruling class became so incredibly toxic, we have to travel much further back in time.
Okay, so we need to leave the ashes of Beijing in 1644 and journey all the way back to roughly 200 BC to the chaotic founding of the Han Dynasty. We have to talk about the White Horse Covenant.
Yes. The White Horse Covenant is the foundational political myth and the ultimate social contract of the Chinese imperial system.
Let's set the stage for that. The founder of the Han Dynasty is a man named Liu Bang.
Right.
He has just emerged victorious from a massive apocalyptic civil war to take control of the Chinese empire. But Liu Bang, who actually started his life as a peasant, knows perfectly well that he didn't conquer the world by himself.
No, he had a lot of help.
He relied on a fragile coalition of brilliant, incredibly powerful generals and ruthless strategists. He needs to secure their permanent loyalty so that the moment he turns his back, they don't simply march their armies on his new capital and overthrow him.
He needed to transition from a warlord to a legitimate emperor. So he gathers his top commanders and most vital advisors, and they perform an incredibly solemn, blood-soaked ritual.
I love this part.
They sacrifice a white horse, a deeply significant animal in ancient Chinese culture. They smear the horse's blood on their lips, and Liu Bang makes a binding, eternal oath with his highest officials.
And the terms of that oath are fascinating. They dictate the flow of power for centuries.
What were the terms?
The oath essentially stated, only those of the Louis bloodline shall hold the title of king. Only those with true military or administrative merit shall hold the title of marquis. If anyone violates this agreement, let the entire world rise up and strike them down.
It is arguably the most important political constitutional arrangement in Chinese history.
It functions like China's equivalent of the Magna Carta, but the mechanics are entirely different.
How so?
Well, when we think of the Magna Carta in England in 1215, it was an adversarial document. The rebellious barons held swords to King John's throat and forced him to limit his own power. You cannot tax us without consent. You cannot imprison us without trial.
Right, it was restriction.
Exactly. But Liu Bang's oath wasn't just a restriction. It created a brilliant co-op model of imperial governance.
Framing it as a co-op model hits the mark perfectly. The White Horse Covenant established a system of dual-track legitimacy. Let's examine the brilliance and the inherent fragility of this system. Track 1 is the bloodline. Only members of the Liu family are permitted to sit on the imperial throne and hold the supreme title of king. The logic here is brutal, but necessary. You need absolute, unquestionable stability at the very apex of the pyramid.
Right, you have to solve the Roman Empire problem.
Exactly.
In ancient Rome, any charismatic general who won a few skirmishes in Gaul and promised his legions enough silver felt he had a legitimate, viable claim to march on Rome and declare himself emperor.
And we know how that went.
Yeah, it resulted in centuries of debilitating, endless civil wars.
By legally monopolizing the ultimate title within one specific bloodline, Liu Bang theoretically took the throne off the table as a prize for ambitious generals. It removed the ultimate incentive for constant usurpation.
That makes total sense.
However, Liu Bang knew he couldn't rule a continent-sized agrarian empire alone. That leads to track 2, merit.
Right, the bureaucracy.
The actual day-to-day power to govern, the administration of the laws, the accumulation of immense wealth, and the prestigious titles of marquis. That power was shared exclusively with the bureaucracy, with the men of proven merit who actually kept the empire functioning.
It is a profound power-sharing agreement. The emperor says, I get the ultimate title, the divine mandate, and the final say. But you, the meritocracy, get to actually run the machinery of the state, gain incredible wealth, and pass down your aristocratic status, provided you remain capable and loyal.
It requires a remarkably delicate balance. And this balance ties directly into the philosophical concept of the mandate of heaven.
Oh, yeah.
Notice the final clause of the oath. If this is violated, let the world rise up and strike them.
It's a built-in self-destruct button.
Exactly. This oath essentially provided a legal justification for rebellion.
Yeah.
It codified the radical idea that the emperor is not an infallible god who can act with absolute impunity.
Right.
If the emperor broke the deal, if he began bypassing the meritocracy to give high administrative titles to his unqualified drinking buddies or his favorite concubine's family, the contract was null and void.
The mandate of heaven is instantly revoked. The people have the right to burn the palace down.
Consider the immense trust required to maintain this system. The emperor absolutely needs the scholar officials to govern the vast, illiterate peasant population. He cannot collect taxes or build canals alone.
No.
But the officials equally need the emperor to provide the overarching umbrella of divine legitimacy, the legal and philosophical framework that justifies their authority over the peasants.
They are locked in this symbiotic embrace, but a purely legalistic, rational system of cold laws isn't enough to hold that kind of high-stakes, deeply human relationship together.
It wasn't. The system demanded constant, careful maintenance. It required the emperor to dispense private favors, to offer extra-legal rewards, to forgive minor infractions, and to actively build deep personal relationships with his top officials to keep the peace.
It was messy.
It was a deeply human system, fundamentally reliant on mutual obligation and respect. When that delicate balance was maintained, the symbiosis was beautiful. The emperor reigned securely, the meritocracy ruled efficiently, and the empire thrived.
But fast forward back to the Ming Dynasty, and we witness the catastrophic results of an emperor deciding he is entirely tired of this co-op model.
Yeah, the balance broke.
We see what happens when the absolute ruler decides he no longer wants to share power or respect the merit track of the bureaucracy.
This brings us to the fatal structural shift that ultimately doomed the Ming Empire. It revolves around the relentless desire for total unyielding control.
Micromanagement.
Exactly. Throughout the long arc of Chinese history, emperors constantly engaged in a tug-of-war with the power of their own bureaucracy. An ambitious, forceful emperor often felt suffocated by the scholar officials, who were constantly quoting ancient Confucian texts to tell him what he legally or morally could not do.
The officials were the ultimate wet blanket, like, sorry, Your Majesty, ancient tradition dictates you must mourn your mother for 3 years, so you cannot build that expensive new pleasure palace or launch that war.
Right. So to escape these constraints, many emperors aimed to create a completely rationalized system. They wanted to govern by strict, unbreakable law, rigid procedure, and direct, unquestionable command.
They want it to be absolute.
They wanted to eliminate the personal whims, the moral posturing, and the deeply entrenched interests of the bureaucracy. They sought to centralize all power entirely in their own hands.
And during the Ming Dynasty, this drive for centralization reached its absolute terrifying peak.
It really did.
Early in the dynasty, the founding emperor made a radical, utterly unprecedented move. He abolished the role of the prime minister entirely.
Just wiped it out.
He didn't just fire the man holding the office, he executed him for treason and then permanently erased the position from the imperial org chart. The emperor decided to take on all the executive, day-to-day administrative duties personally.
It was a drastic attempt to remove any intermediary between the throne and the levers of power. But we really have to examine the profound psychological devastation this caused within the ranks of the government.
How did it affect them?
Well, when one family, and specifically one single man, holds absolute micromanaged power over every single minor decision, from tax policy to the promotion of a low-level clerk, the state undergoes a fundamental transformation in the minds of its servants.
Right.
It ceases to feel like a shared empire, a grand collective project. It begins to feel like a private family estate.
The entire empire just becomes the emperor's personal backyard. The officials are just the hired landscapers.
And as a perfect analogy, the relationship between the ruler and the official turns incredibly cold. It becomes purely transactional. The high-ranking official is no longer a valued partner in the sacred duty of governance. He is merely a disposable employee of the imperial household.
The parallels to modern organizational psychology here are striking. It sounds exactly like working for a deeply toxic, hyper-controlling startup founder.
Oh, absolutely.
Imagine a founder who refuses to delegate anything. He micromanages every single department, insisting on approving every line of code, every marketing email, every minor expense.
Right.
Crucially, he refuses to give any equity or stock options to the early employees who actually built the product. He hoards 100% of the shares for himself.
Yep.
But despite hoarding all the ownership, he turns around and demands that his employees work 100-hour weeks, sleep under their desks, and sacrifice their health and personal lives out of a fabricated sense of loyalty to the company's grand mission.
The breakdown in morale in that scenario is totally inevitable.
Eventually, the employees burn out entirely. You stop feeling like a valued partner building something great, and you start feeling like an underpaid, exhausted consultant.
You realize you have no real stake in the outcome.
Exactly. So you just punch the clock, collect your check, and detach yourself emotionally from the fate of the company.
Now, overlay that toxic startup mentality onto the late Ming bureaucracy. Let's dive deep into the internal monologue of a high-ranking official during the Chengjian Emperor's final desperate reign.
What's he thinking?
This official sits in his lavish study, listening to the reports of rebel armies advancing. He thinks to himself, I did not attain this exalted rank because the emperor graciously bestowed it upon me.
I earned it.
I passed the most brutal, mind-breaking exams in the world. I studied for 30 years in a freezing cell. I earned this position through my own undeniable intellectual merit and my family's immense sacrifice. The emperor did not give me my brain.
I am the one providing value. I made myself indispensable.
Precisely his mindset. And now, he thinks, this emperor, who happens to have inherited his ultimate position purely by the sheer luck of birth, who treats me with constant suspicion, who micromanages my every administrative move, and who might have me publicly beaten with bamboo in the imperial court if I offer a dissenting opinion.
Yeah, that happened a lot.
This emperor now demands that I empty my family's private, accumulated fortune to pay his starving soldiers to protect his private business.
Why should I?
Exactly. Why should I sacrifice my life and the multi-generational wealth of my descendants for his family's failing, mismanaged enterprise?
When you lay out the internal logic like that, their refusal to donate makes complete sense. It highlights a total shift in identity. We are analyzing the profound cultural shift from what we might call feudal loyalty to the mindset of a professional mercenary.
That's the core of it.
Because in the ancient feudal model, the social contract was deeply personal. Your lord gave you land, wealth, and physical protection, and in return, you swore a solemn blood oath to die for him on the battlefield.
But under the absolute hyper-centralized, deeply micromanaged autocracy of the late Ming Dynasty, that vital personal bond was completely severed.
It was gone.
The official is no longer a sworn bannerman fighting for his liege. He is a career bureaucrat. He is a professional mercenary. He is simply renting his highly specialized administrative skills to the state.
And when the hostile takeover arrives, when Li Zicheng's massive rebel army is battering down the gates of Beijing with siege engines, the employees do not link arms and fight to the death in the lobby to protect the CEO.
No, they don't.
They pack up their desks, update their resumes, fiercely protect their bank accounts, and quietly wait to see who the new boss is going to be.
Right.
Their mercenary logic dictates the new warlord is going to need accountants, tax collectors, and administrators to run this empire, just like the old guy did. I have the skills. I'll just go work for him.
They vastly underestimated the sheer chaos, violence, and vindictiveness of the transition. But their fundamental operating logic was entirely mercenary. And this brings us full circle, connecting this mercenary mindset directly back to the fatal paradox of the donation system we began with.
Let's weave all these threads together, because the donation system failed the emperor on the eve of destruction.
We established that the donation system, the Wanxian, was fundamentally a financial transaction. The citizen buys a title or an office. Now, when macroeconomic times are good, when the empire is prosperous, stable, and expanding, the company is thriving. The titles and offices the state is selling possess real, tangible, social, and economic value. They guarantee a return.
And people want them.
So ambitious people eagerly invest. They gladly donate massive sums of silver to acquire that status.
The stock price is climbing, the market is bullish, so people are desperately buying in.
But when times are catastrophically bad, when there are decade-long famines, when the imperial treasury is completely depleted, when massive, heavily armed rebel armies are marching unopposed on the capital, the company is visibly, undeniably tanking.
It's crashing.
The state is rapidly losing its fundamental power to enforce its laws, collect its taxes, or physically protect its citizens. Therefore, the titles, offices, and promises the state is desperately trying to sell become effectively, immediately worthless.
Right.
Why would a rational actor purchase a magistrate position in a provincial county currently occupied by a rebel warlord?
You are buying shares in Blockbuster Video in the year 2010. You are throwing capital into a black hole. It is a terrible, irrational investment.
It reveals the donation system as a fundamentally flawed financial instrument for state survival. The system functions incredibly well when it is needed the least, during times of abundant peace and prosperity.
Oh, that's ironic.
Right. But during an existential crisis, when the state desperately, urgently requires a massive injection of capital just to survive the month, the perceived value of what the state is offering plummets to absolute zero.
Because the state has nothing of value left to sell.
Exactly. And because the elite officials and the wealthy merchant class have been systematically conditioned by the system itself to think like cold, rational investors rather than loyal, self-sacrificing subjects, nobody gives a single cent.
Wow.
The very mechanism designed to save the empire guarantees its ultimate destruction.
That is a chilling realization. It is a perfect, catastrophic storm of terrible incentives. The government built a system that actively selected for selfishness, and then died of surprise when everyone acted selfishly.
There is a profound, incredibly perceptive quote from the 17th century political philosopher Huang Zhongzhi. He personally lived through the traumatic, bloody transition from the Ming to the Qing.
Okay, so he saw it happen.
He watched the horrific collapse we've been discussing firsthand, and he spent the rest of his life intensely analyzing why it happened. He famously wrote, "The people are the hosts, the emperor is the guest."
The people are the hosts, the emperor is the guest. That completely inverts the entire philosophical concept of absolute divine monarchy. It places the ultimate permanence on the population, not the ruler.
It does. And if we connect this philosophical insight to the broader picture of the late Ming bureaucracy, we see that the scholar officials had internalized a highly cynical, twisted version of this idea.
How so?
In their eyes, the Chongzhen emperor was indeed just a guest, a temporary, highly demanding occupant of the throne who could easily be replaced by another warlord. The officials felt they were ready to serve the next guest, whoever that might be, just so long as the house, meaning the massive bureaucratic structure that guaranteed their own status, wealth, and power, remained standing.
But they were wrong.
Their fatal miscalculation was failing to realize that when a powerful guest is violently, forcefully evicted, the house almost always burns down with them.
Synthesizing this entire journey, we began with the tragic, cinematic image of the Chongzhen Emperor hanging himself from a tree on Coal Hill, furious and despairing at his greedy officials for refusing to fund the defense of his capital.
Right.
But what we've uncovered by looking at the underlying mechanics is that the Ming Dynasty didn't fall simply because a few selfish individuals decided to hide their silver in the cellar.
No, the fall of Beijing was the final gasp of a structural rot that took centuries to fully develop. It collapsed because the fundamental architecture of the state underwent a toxic shift.
It lost its way.
It moved away from a shared cooperative cause built on mutual trust and the dual-track legitimacy established by the White Horse Covenant. It systematically devolved into a hyper-managed, centralized autocracy where public office, and therefore public trust, could be bought and sold like grain.
It turned the sacred philosophical duty of governance into a cold, transactional business. And when the ultimate crisis arrived at the city walls, the officials looked at the flaming balance sheet of the empire, looked at the relentless demands of their micromanaging CEO, and decided, in the end, it was simply a terrible investment.
Yeah.
They closed their wallets and let the empire fall.
The collapse was the mathematically logical conclusion of a system that had actively destroyed its own moral and cooperative foundation.
Which leaves us with a truly unsettling thought about how power, loyalty, and organizations are structured, even today. We looked closely at the Qing dynasty's calculated tactic of intentionally using donor officials to check the power of the traditional bureaucracy.
We did.
They weaponized a transactional system specifically to ensure blind loyalty to the boss, rather than fostering loyalty to the ideals of the system itself.
It raises a vital question, one that applies far beyond the walls of Imperial China. It applies to modern corporations, political parties, and institutions.
It really does.
And it is something for you, listening to this, to deeply ponder. When a leader or an organization intentionally creates alternative, purely transactional paths to power, when they actively bypass merit, bypass shared foundational values, all in order to guarantee personal, sycophantic loyalty to the person at the top, can that ever truly succeed in creating a stronger, more resilient organization?
Or does engineering a system based entirely on personal debt, financial transaction, and the bypassing of merit inevitably guarantee its own corrupt, catastrophic downfall? When the ash finally clears and the hostile takeover is complete, does the reliance on professional mercenaries leave the leader standing entirely alone? It is absolutely something to think about the next time you hear someone argue that the government, or any vital public institution, should be run exactly like a business. Because sometimes the business goes completely bankrupt, and the CEO is left entirely alone on the hill.
If you found this discussion useful, maybe learned something new, definitely hit that subscribe button. We do these deep dives regularly, exploring valuable ideas.
We appreciate you tuning in.
Yeah, thanks for joining us.